Picking up on that story, South Korea's Constitutional Court has begun proceedings into a case to impeach the president almost 2 weeks after Yoon Suk Yeol's short-lived imposition of martial law. The first public hearing scheduled for the 27th of December that will confirm major legal issues of this case. Our 6 court justices now have 180 days in which they have to decide whether to remove Mr Yoon or reinstate him. But Mr Yoon is under no obligation to attend that hearing next week. If the court should proceed to uphold impeachment, fresh presidential elections must be held within 2 months. Local media say Mr Yoon has appointed former prosecutor Kim Hong-il as his chief legal representative. But the leader has vowed to fight until the end, even as he faces calls to bring him in for further questioning. Prosecutors have issued a second summons over insurrection after Mr Yoon did not turn up as requested yesterday. If he fails to come forward this week, investigators could seek a court arrest warrant. Mr Yoon's ruling People Power Party, meantime, has taken another hit amid continued political uncertainty. PPP leader Han Dong-hoon resigned today, saying his position had become untenable after he gave his backing for the impeachment vote to go ahead over the weekend. Mr Han has faced backlash within the party but has stood by his decision. There is still a chance that Yoon Suk Yeol could be reinstated through the Constitutional Court's impeachment trial. Political discussion in South Korea already shifting to who could be the next leader. CNA's Grace Shin is here to tell us more.
All right, Wei-Soo. Now, Mr. Yoon's political fate is actually hangs in the balance. And let's take a look at the likely contenders for the president if he is removed from the top job. Now, front and center is none other than Lee Jae-myung, and that's according to a recent poll conducted just after Mr. Yoon's botched martial law declaration, which found 37% chose Lee as their preferred candidate to take over as leader. And Mr. Lee is the chair of the main opposition Democratic Party of Korea and has been the leading voice in favor of Yoon's impeachment. But there could be some hurdles ahead as Mr. Lee himself faces several ongoing trials against him. And former Justice Minister and until today ruling People Power Party chief Han Dong-hoon is another contender. Although he's just stepped down from his PPP role, it is still possible that he could run for president if Yoon is removed from office. He has his own supporters and could technically run as an independent candidate. The former prosecutor disagreed with the president over the imposition of martial law, but was once Mr. Yoon's staunchest ally. Seoul Mayor Oh Se-hoon has also emerged as someone who could throw their hat in the ring. Re-elected mayor in 2022, he is the first in Seoul's history to be elected to 4 terms. The mayoralty of South Korea's capital has long been seen as a pathway to the presidency. And meanwhile, 2 other men who have come to the fore are Gyeonggi Governor Kim Dong-yeon from the Democratic Party and Daegu Mayor Hong Jun-pyo. With a wealth of political experience behind them, Kim ran for the presidency in 2022, and Hong was Yoon's main contender in the right-wing presidential primary in 2021. And Wei-Soo, that's all I have for you in terms of potential contenders.
All right, Grace, you've got that list there. In principle, any one of them could win, or in principle, right?
In principle.
Yeah, but in an imaginary world, if elections are called tomorrow, who would win?
As you says, this is in principle, and there's 2 variables we need to consider. It's number 1, which party can regain political trust the quickest? And number 2, it's when will the snap elections take place? And I'd like to delve into the latter first, because if these snap elections were to take place as early as May or as latest as July and August, we still need to see how that plays out with Lee Jae-myung's criminal charges verdict still going on. Now, if the Supreme Court finalizes their verdict decision, this may bar Lee Jae-myung from even running in the presidential election when, as it seems like now, he is a top contender, given that he already had expertise in 2022 going against President Yoon Suk Yeol. And also, usually when we saw impeachment cases in the past with Park Geun-hye, the Saenuri party at the time, which was the conservatives, had to hand over the reins to the liberals, which was the now DP. So you can see that we see a stark contrast in where the public decides to stand by following these impeachment cases, making Lee Jae-myung a very top candidate. But then again, public approval ratings aren't too up for Lee Jae-myung, given that criminal charges are still ongoing. And If you remember, back in 2022, President Yoon won by the narrowest margin in the presidential election. Also, we also need to consider that the political trust built among a lot of the public is still at risk, given that many know that the South Korean public is able to practice their ability to impeach a president. But that being said, they know that having trust for a leader is down in the low. Recent polls, though, have found a rising political star, and that's Won Sik. He is the national speaker from the National Assembly. And given that many footage of him trying to cross over the fence on the night of the martial law decree, where he tried to stop the martial law from being imposed, many started to have hope that this politician might be able to change the course of history. But that being said, only 56% said they could trust him. And in the remainder of the list of contenders, the amount of trust that people had towards the contenders that we just looked at right now, whether it be Lee Jae-myung or Han Dong-un, it stayed in the low, around 11 to 41%. So it's still very up in the air, and we'll see how it goes.
All right, Grace, thanks for that. We're going to be putting a variant of that question to our expert this evening, Stephen Nagy from Seoul. He's professor of politics and international studies at the International Christian University. He joins us from Seoul. Professor Nagy, I asked Grace, if elections were called hypothetically tomorrow, who would win? I'll change that question slightly. So if timing is everything, Lee Jae-myung might win if we get elections before he gets any verdict on his criminal charges. But the ruling party, the PPP, whatever time elections are held next year, as they are likely to be if Mr Yoon is impeached, you do not see the PPP regaining lost ground, winning back the National Assembly, let alone installing a president next year, do you?
No, I don't. I think that the declaration of martial law by President Yoon, his impeachment, and really hundreds of thousands of South Korean citizens coming to the middle of Seoul to put pressure on the government to get him to step down is indicative of the public support for the conservative PPP party. Whether President Yoon is charged for some kind of criminal act or not, as you mentioned, treason or otherwise, I think that the trust in the PPP at this particular stage, the fact that in the first impeachment, many lawmakers didn't show up, suggests that they're not in a favorable position. And if the election was held in the next 2-3 weeks, I do think it'll be the Democratic Party of Korea's Lee Jae-myung who would be the president today.
We saw, of course, the leader of the PPP resigning today. And if I quote him, this, of course, is in translation, there will be no future for conservatism if the party entertains views such as election fraud conspiracy. Is that his way, Mr. Han Dong-hoon's way of trying to salvage whatever credibility is left for the PPP so that even if it doesn't win in this political cycle, it has a better chance, perhaps 2 years, 5 years down the road?
Absolutely. I think that they have to take responsibility for what happened, for the declaration of martial law, how unorganized it was, and the very fact that some lawmakers did not impeach President Yoon right away. I think that this is indicative that the Conservative Party's leadership under Han Do-hoon is positioning the Conservative Party again for sustainability to come back in a year or 2 years and to ensure that it's relevant within the South Korean political context. Whether it can do that or not, obviously will depend on the success of the next government, whoever will be in charge. But again, they're laying the framework or the foundation for returning to power at some point of time in the future and to disconnect themselves from this declaration of martial law and really the domestic political chaos that I think we've watched for you in Singapore, but globally.
Professor Nagy, I'll get back to that night of the attempt to swap out a civilian government and the investigation since then, and I suppose the generalizations we might make based on investigations from then. But for now, if we look at Yoon Suk Yeol, you also cover Japan as one of your areas of expertise. That is another the former Prime Minister losing his place in government. Both these leaders, certainly in Washington circles, they were, I suppose, their policies were welcomed in terms of moving closer in alignment both with Tokyo as well as in Washington. If that should change, the leadership now in South Korea, we've got Lee Jae-myung, assuming he takes over, or someone from his party. This is a man in March last year openly calling Japan a hostile state, openly saying China must not be provoked. We're looking at a real change in South Korea's foreign policy.
We should be clear that President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida, who are no longer going to be in power, did work very well with the Biden administration. It was not just the United States that was happy with this alignment. Canada, Australia, many European countries, of course, the political entity of Taiwan, felt that this was the right direction for both Seoul and Tokyo to be going in terms of putting the past behind them, dealing with it behind closed doors, and using their collective resources to invest in a rules-based order. And I think for many allies, not just the United States, and I want to really emphasize that, many allies and friends of these countries viewed that this was the right trajectory. And with the downfall of both of these leaders, it's going to have serious consequences, I think, for security within the region. And you're correct. Lee Jae-myung made a very interesting comment. He said, we shouldn't provoke China. We should say "谢谢你" to China and "谢谢你" to Taiwan, and not be part of this collaboration between the Japanese and the United States in what he voiced as provoking China. And I think the reality is that South Korea's economic future is very much related to not only the fate of Japan and the United States, but also political entities like Taiwan. Those critical sea lanes of communication that go around Taiwan, that ferry $5.5 trillion US of trade, energy resources, all of this is directly connected to South Korea as well. And his comments, I thought, were very provocative and would fundamentally, I think, create huge challenges for peace and stability in the region.
Professor Nagy, a final question. Because you have been in South Korea, coincidentally, even as martial law was declared late on the 3rd of December. Since then, we've had investigations into what happened that day, what sort of coordination, and the picture that is emerging is of almost outright chaos and a failure to properly coordinate. Your suggestion from that is that perhaps South Korea has matured as a democracy and leaders or governments are no longer quite so accustomed to knowing how to implement martial law anymore, and the military as well, increasingly professionalized and therefore less likely, less able to just do as a president should tell them to do. Final question.
So I was a bit impressed by, I guess, the civil society coming together to push back against President Yoon's declaration of martial law, but also I think the discipline within the military to not enforce his demand. And I think this is representative of, again, a military that has been professionalized. It makes a choice, and it's decided that it's not interested in putting military power on the people of South Korea, but maintaining peace and stability in the South Korean context and ensuring that institutions and the people's voices are the ones that lead South Korean democracy. And in this sense, I think that the failure of President Yoon was a victory for South Korean democracy and for its strong institutions to stop martial law. But at the same time, it may have consequences, as I mentioned and alluded to earlier, in terms of a potential Democratic Party of Korea leader who is vehemently against Japan and against the United States and against, I guess, the broader investment in a rules-based order that really props up the prosperity and peace for South Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia, where you're located.
So real repercussions for Mr. Yoon's what he used to call the global pivotal state of South Korea. Thanks, Stephen Nagy, Professor of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Japan, but he is in Seoul right now.